Are Hong Kong's Beijing-backed authorities winning their war of attrition, or will the violence of the past 48 hours revitalize a weary pro-democracy movement? This Monday, one of the most violent days in more than 2 months since student-led protesters first pitched their tents in key parts of downtown Hong Kong. At least 40 arrests, government offices closed at one point, and the legislature suspended as sit-ins and clashes spilled over. Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying hinting further police action may be imminent. This after the High Court granted an injunction ordering the clearance of several parts of the major protest site in the Admiralty district of downtown Hong Kong. And as Beijing refuses to budge on the vetting of candidates in that former British colony, Leung knows support for the protests has waned of late among residents, weary of the transport disruption. We're going to look at what's to come, both in the short term and in the long run for Hong Kong, whose fate has others worried, most notably Taiwan, where anti-Beijing nationalists have set to tip the tide in that country. Today in the France 24 debate, is it the beginning of the end for the Occupy Central movement? With us from Hong Kong, Chris Cheng, columnist for HK Politics. Thank you for joining us and welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Also joining us here in the studio, Alice Ekman of the French Institute for International Relations, IFRI. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate, where you can always join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter our hashtag F24debate. Chris, let me begin with you and begin with the latest news we're hearing. 3 of those student protesters announcing they're going to go on hunger strike, including a very prominent one, Joshua Yang.
Yeah, so it's Joshua Wong. So he just announced this night, after the failed campaign last night on surrounding the government buildings, he's going to an indefinite hunger strike to force the government to respond to the demands.
How has that news been greeted, and what's been the mood tonight as night falls in Hong Kong?
Well, there has been sort of a tradition for Hong Kong politicians and student groups to go on hunger strikes, but I would say no one ever died or had very serious damage out of a hunger strike. So people are not expecting him to go to that level. But if he goes to that level, that might be some new things that we have never seen. That a senior or a prominent political figure in Hong Kong really have some serious damage due to hunger strike.
Joshua Wong, only 18 years old. He's certainly been one of the faces in the crowd.
Yes. He's just passed his birthday, and people, of course, still worry about whether that will be a very, very serious damage to himself, because he's very young, not like the other politicians usually in their 40s or 50s, and go on hunger strike for usually 2 days or just 3 days.
Chris, when you think back 48 hours before the violence started to spike, what was your prediction for the outcome then, and what's your prediction for the outcome of this movement now?
Well, I think people have been prepared for the violence of the police, because that is what they have done for the last 2 months. It's just how serious would that be? How would they use their forces? We have seen police use from pepper sprays, from batons, to now something called special units, which more than half of them are actually airport security or other forces that we don't know, never confirmed about it. So these tactical units are very, very specialized, very experienced, and they're used against really armed protesters. That is something we have not prepared for, and all they can do, as I have seen, is when they see these kind of police, they can just leave. There's nothing they can do to really deter these police unless they use violence, which they still don't want to use it right now.
Alice Ekman, are you surprised at developments of the past 48 hours?
Well, it was expected partly because the police had announced that it would try to remove parts of the protesters. So it's true that it's a significant development, because it's the most violent development since the movement started, Occupy Central movement started. At the same time, if you look at a Beijing perspective, Beijing has no interest in seeing an escalation of tension. So now
the sort of the war of attrition was working, you might say.
it is partly working. If you remember when we were discussing about the situation a few months ago, there were risks of escalation of tension which were much higher than today. Still today violence is remaining, and Beijing really has a lot on its plate currently. A lot of tension within mainland China, not only in Hong Kong, but within mainland China. You have social unrest, you have environmental unrest, you also have ethnic tension in Xinjiang. You have a lot of issues that Beijing has to deal with. So I'm not sure that, for example, negotiations are totally on the side, because Joshua Wong, the leader of the protesters, is now on hunger strike to request a resumption, to resume negotiation with the Hong Kong authorities, to resume discussion and negotiation, which has stopped stopped completely. So the resumption might happen if, considering that Beijing does not want to see an escalation of tension. At the same time, we also have to take into consideration that this happened quite at the same time as another flashpoint in Asia and in the Chinese world, we could say, in Taiwan. Local election just took place in Taiwan, as you mentioned earlier. And the DPP is a party who's rather pro-independence, won largely the election. And the Kuomintang, which is rather pro-China, lost most of the major cities of the country. So we cannot really compare the situation in Taiwan and Hong Kong, because the situation is very different, and the administrative system as well, and relation with the mainland is different. But at the same time, the two are echoing each other. And what is happening in Hong Kong is watched very closely in Taiwan by the population. So it might affect future development in Taiwan and the coming election, presidential election in 2016.
And that partly explains why there isn't a full-scale crackdown.
Exactly, exactly.
Chris Cheng, again, are you a little bit surprised seeing that, well, as our correspondent pointed out, you've had this sort of war of attrition that's been going on now. People are tired. It's been more than 2 months, and the weather doing the rest. It's a time of year where it gets cold and it's dark. Are you surprised that now we suddenly have this flare-up in confrontation?
Well, frankly, no. I think people are dire to find a solution out of this, both the protesters and the government. And the government solution is, of course, what you have said at the start of the program, which is the injunction. They use the injunction to clear the protest site, the remaining ones, saying these people are not helping with the bailies to clear the protests, so police have to join in to clear the protests. And the protesters, the students, have to find a way out to gain back the people's support, or even inside their own camp, to have more support to deal with the government. So both sides are finding a solution, and it seems like the solution is no way out. And the only thing we can think of is maybe next week, then the clearing action in Admiralty, the largest remaining protesting site, will happen.
All right, I want to get your reaction to this, Chris, because we have one viewer who said to us on Twitter, with a massive regional power like China around the corner, I don't know if the protesters realize the geographical complexity. I think I could turn the question a slightly different way, which is hearing what Alice Ekman said about how China, it's not in its interests to have a full-scale crackdown. Would you say that protesters have been playing on that?
Well, it's hard because we don't really have a long history with China. We've just been back to China for 17 years, and most people, well, as the Chinese authority would claim, we don't have a very good national education. And we don't know much about China. So Hong Kong people usually don't have that kind of knowledge to deal with what Chinese authority would do and to make it into a larger level. What we usually do, these protesters, they care on the local level. They have a slogan saying Hong Kong's problems should be dealt with Hong Kong. It shouldn't be dealt with Beijing or something. But they did realize after the talk with the government last month that seems to be failed. That's why they tried to go to Beijing, but they can't even leave Hong Kong. So that seems like to be in a deadlock. They can't deal with the problem in Hong Kong, and Beijing doesn't want to talk to them as well. That seems to be no way out.
So there's definitely a local specificity to Hong Kong people. See, sometimes I say it in that context. And as we've been saying, some of the most violent scuffles of the protest movement occurring over the past 48 hours, they've been preceded and followed by stern warnings, plural, from authorities.
落去呢， From this day on, the police will take resolute action when carrying out their duties. I call on the students who are thinking of returning to the occupation area tonight not to do so. Do not think that the police tolerance in the past means they are incapable of handling the situation. Don't mistake the police tolerance as weakness. The police and the government are responsible for maintaining social order as soon as possible.
Chris Cheng, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I don't think people really listen to him because CY Lun, the chief executive, have been saying this over 2 months, saying they are striking hardline on the protesters, which is the fact, and it has been doing for 2 months. It's just people are angry at the police that the violence of them are escalating, using more weapons, more new weapons. There are always news of new weapons and more people hurt with the new weapons. So doesn't.
Well, the connection breaking up slightly there with Hong Kong. We'll try to fix that. Alice Ekman, we've also heard a growing number of people in Hong Kong, merchants, people work in the transport sector, be they taxi drivers or other people, increasingly disgruntled. It's been dragging on.
Yeah, well, you have a division of the Hong Kong population around this movement. It's true that the movement has been largely popular, very supported, especially by the young people. And you have in Hong Kong a strong generation gap that is emerging, and this generation gap is related to how people identify themselves with Hong Kong itself. The Hong Kongese identity is now developing, reinforcing within the younger generation. And there is a gap with their parents, who sometimes identify themselves more with the Chinese word, even if it's not with mainland China or even with Britain. So you have a different relation with identity, and you also have a strong gap related to, let's say, the political culture and the education system as well. The political culture that is existing in Hong Kong is different from the mainland, completely different, and this is something quite new that Beijing has to handle, because progressively mainland Chinese government is starting to understand that the political culture is very different in Hong Kong and mainland China, and as a result, yeah.
But different for how long? When we see, for instance, the number of Mandarin speakers is increasing sharply. Travelers who go there now, they're hearing less and less Cantonese and more Mandarin. Well,
one of the objectives of this movement is to maintain the specific political identity and culture of Hong Kong. So it depends also on what's going on now to say how long this will prevail. But what I wanted to underline is that now Beijing seems to take into consideration the culture gap and to manage, let's say, the movement in Hong Kong differently than what he would have done in mainland China, which would have been more traditional top-down control and censorship.
All right, so a more subtle approach. Chris Cheng, I want to pick up on one of the points Alice just mentioned, and that is the generation gap in Hong Kong. Would you say that generation gap has widened over the past 2 months?
The generation gap always existed, but these kind of protests, this kind of conflict actually reveal the surface of the generation gap. So it has been there. Like one legislator called Regina Eve, she criticized the processes using new technology into these protests. And when young people hear about that, that seems absurd, because most people, to them, these kind of new technology using WhatsApp, using fire chat, using Facebook or even Twitter, it's part of their life. And this is something, it seems like for them, 40 years, 50 years old, even older people can't understand. But this is their way of life, and this is how they organize themselves. And so these kind of conflicts actually existed for more than a decade. It has been discussed for more than a decade. It's just the protest has moved up this issue to the surface into something from economical issues, from social issues, into, at the end, the political system issues that these kind of political system in Hong Kong never helped these young people.
All right, I can't let the two of you get away without talking about the tiff between London and Beijing we've witnessed over the past 48 hours. Hong Kong at the center of that. British Prime Minister David Cameron denouncing a Chinese decision to prevent a committee of British MPs to visit. That in turn prompting this response from Beijing?
Sorry.
All right, hopefully we'll play that for you a little bit later on. Basically, the Foreign Ministry spokesman Alice Ekman saying that there's accusing the British of being responsible for overt confrontation that's not beneficial for Sino-British ties.
Mm-hmm. Well, it has to be understood in the broader context of latest declaration of the MPs, and also of the fact that this delegation is seen by Beijing as an investigation delegation. So whatever the outcome of this investigation, it is certainly not welcome from Beijing perspective, who is often emphasizing on so-called Western interference in Chinese affairs. So, I mean, it's in line with general discourse on potential interference of foreign countries, and especially of countries who are promoting democracies. This is in Beijing perspective, of course. And in this context, in its TEN context, it's nothing surprising so much, because it's in line with previous declaration of the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Chris Cheng, in the current context, is Britain irrelevant to what's going on in Hong Kong, or does this row matter?
Well, I would say some people will think it's relevant. So last week, some dozens of people started sleeping outside the British consulate in Hong Kong. They're claiming that Britain is one of the co-signers on the Joint Declaration, and they should have a part in it. So at least they got some support, such as a few hundred people helping them set up camps outside the British consulate. And they have some support saying, some Hong Kong people think that British should have a part. This is what they should have promised, and they should have kept up to the promise even until right now.
We'll leave it there. I want to thank you, Chris Cheng, for being with us from Hong Kong. I want to thank as well Alice Ekman for joining us here in the studio. Stay